So there are languages which consider time to be coming towards them or time to be moving away from them. So when you have a sentence, for example, like, can we bring this meeting forward? Some people will think that means, like, I would think that means, like, make it sooner. And some people would mean, like, can we make that, like, later in the day? And so, yeah, your concepts are rather than just exist, like, affecting how you sort of communicate with people, it also affects other concepts about, like, for example, time, or how you interact with other people and all that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And we got a correction for you.
Ooh.
Yes. So I think you are so right in what you were saying, and what you just said there was correct as well. But I think the issue was the languages you used as examples.
I think I said French.
I think you said French. And French people do, you were right, French people do speak about it, sort of time coming towards them or having time, I think. I can't remember the exact comment. But you were generally sort of correct in what you were saying. But that wasn't necessarily an example that sort of matches there. I think the examples that I've got are, let's say, Hebrew, right? In English, what direction does text go?
Left to right.
Exactly. We read text from left to right. And in Hebrew, what direction does text go? What direction do you read?
Oh, God, I think right to left.
Yeah, well done. Yeah, good process of elimination.
It's not up and down. Well, because it could be up and down, like
Chinese or Mandarin, I think. Yeah,
possibly
I think
hieroglyphics as well, maybe.
Hieroglyphs, really? Are they?
I don't know. I'm going to get another correction. I'm going to say, I don't know.
But I would say that hieroglyphics, I don't think they're a language so much as just a writing system. But yes.
Sure.
Yeah. I'm not saying that for you. We're saying it for the little pedants.
Don't worry, we'll ask Tom Scott.
Stop doing that. Okay?
I'm sorry.
Stop doing that.
I'll ask my sister. She studied linguistics.
Okay, good. Do you want to go on to lateral again? Lateral with Tom Scott?
Please have me back, Tom Scott. I'm very sorry, Tom Scott.
Stop winding him up, okay? Because you know that Tom Scott watches all...
I know, and I know that he will actually find it quite distressing. Bless him. Okay, I'm very sorry. Tom Scott is not a linguist. Stop saying it.
Yes, thank you, Luke. Anyway, so we're talking about different languages. So Hebrew and English, for example. Let's say Hebrew goes right to left, English left to right when you're reading it. So when we're trying to sort of place stuff spatially, let's say, in English, or for English speakers, if you're saying, okay, place these images in a timeline, they'll place the timeline going from left to right in terms of that's sort of chronological order. People that speak Hebrew are more likely to do it the other way. You know, it's quite interesting, right? So time goes from left to right for English speakers generally because we read from left to right. That's just a sort of natural thing for us.
Okay, so I've got an example of how you kind of wrap your head around that, because obviously conceptually you can understand, you can imagine what that might be like, but actually experientially that feels totally bizarre if you're somebody whose language moves from left to right, right?
Yeah.
So imagine if I asked you to sort of order events that happened before and after your birth. Right?
But nothing happened before your birth, Luke.
Now, nothing happened before my birth. So if you were born after me, congratulations, you do exist. And if you were born before me, you were a figment of my imagination for a while. I wonder what that was like for you. So if you imagine things that happened like 10 years before your birth, that would be like on the left-hand side of that center point, the center point being your birth. And something that happened 10 years after your birth would be like on the right-hand side. And that's not exactly things moving right to left, but it's things sort of being on the opposite side of a center point, which to me feels kind of weird, right?
If you think about it, another way is when we did number lines in school, or even if you write numbers, it would be weird to write the numbers increasing from right to left. So 1 and then to the left of the 1, 2, 3. It would seem odd. It'd be like you're counting down because you read in the opposite direction. And because time is like, we can kind of view it as like an increasing of numbers, like years just increase. It makes sense to sort of do it that way.
Yeah, and crucially, like that, but that's exactly what you do when you then write negative numbers on that number line. So if you're writing your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 going left to right, while your -1, -2, -3, -4, -5 is going right to left. And that's exactly the same thing.
The digits are increasing. The value is decreasing.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, so like moving on from that, you're so sort of right about what you're saying with time being in front of you or behind you. I want to quickly mention though that Mandarin sees time as a vertical line going upwards usually.
Wow.
And bear in mind that these things are not universal for each language. You know, we're talking in generalities, of course, but it would be a waste of time to be saying that constantly. But yeah, so generally, you know, Mandarin speakers will see time as being a line going upwards. So you could have down week instead of next week, for example, right? So down is the future and up is the past.
Oh, okay, so that's even more mind-blowing, because not only are they going up, down, what they would think as up is what I would think as down. I would think next week is above me if I was doing that.
That's
not next week is down. Oh, wow. That's so confusing.
We can go a step further than this, because you were mentioning, pushing something forward, pushing something forward, or bringing something back. We see time as being sort of ahead of us, as in the future is ahead of us and the past is behind us. But there are other languages that see it slightly differently. So some languages will see time as being the other direction, so that the past is in front of them, the future is behind them, which makes so much more sense conceptually, because you don't know what's going to happen in the future, so you must not be able to see it. But you do know what's happened in the past because you can see it.
You're reversing through time.
Yeah, which is how. And this is really interesting, because in this article that I was reading, or some of the articles that I was reading, it mentioned about how English speakers and German speakers and French speakers really pushed forward science, right? As in, they were the people that really had the monopoly on it for quite some time. And so our understanding of time when it comes to physics and whatnot is likely going to have been, let's say, poisoned, or at the very least influenced by the language that these people were speaking, right? And so our entire conception of time could be really heavily impacted by the people who spoke, by the language that people spoke, the people that study this sort of thing. I just find it really interesting, because ultimately, time going in the sense of the future being behind you and the past being ahead of you makes a lot of sense in terms of I know what happened and I don't know what's happening behind me. That makes so much sense. It's baffling that that's not how we do it. But yes, I guess, the future is ahead of you because we're traveling forwards.
Yeah. It's what you're experiencing.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it makes sense in that sense, but also, I don't think that's enough. I think time being, the future being behind you just makes so much more sense in how we actually experience it.
Makes life feel a lot more scary, though.
I mean,
whoa, it's like you're on a roller coaster going backwards all the time.
Right, well, a roller coaster's at least on rails, man. You're fucking sprinting backwards. But yeah, so that shows us that there's at least an association between how you read language and how your thoughts are organized, which makes sense. I mean, so Daniel Casasanto, he's a cognitive psychologist at Cornell University. He's pointed out, or he's given this sort of way of explaining it, which I find quite useful. So he's talking about different sort of metaphors and whatnot that we'd use for abstract concepts like time. So we tend to think about time and say price and things like these sort of things. We use spatial metaphors for them, right? So a long time, the time is long. So long is a spatial word, right? Length is quite literally a spatial dimension, right? Mm-hmm. We use it to describe time because something that's long, it's stretched out. So if time was longer, it would take more time for that time to happen, right? That's how that metaphor sort of works. Or a high price. These examples are all from the article that I was reading, by the way. You could find that in the description. A high price. Why should price be high or low? I mean, the number, sure, right? But then again, why is it a high number and a low number, right? Like what about those? Why
does it exist? Yes.
Yeah, why are we using that metaphor? And a spatial
as
metaphor.
Opposed to large and small.
Yeah, exactly. And a deep mystery is the last example that's been given.
Ooh.
Which, a deep mystery is, you get deep. And we can understand it, but you can imagine that in another language, they could have completely different metaphors or words used. So, for example, we say we are a certain age, and I believe in French, they say they have a certain age. I guess in German, I think the word for, you wouldn't say someone is tall, you would say they're big, they're gross, and so, if I was to say that you were big, that wouldn't, in English, that wouldn't really convey that I was saying, oh, looks tall. Big would mean like large in a different, like in multiple dimensions. 2 dimensions,
yeah, at
exactly.
Least, yeah.
And I find that quite interesting, that there are all these little differences, right? So Daniel Casasanto, what he said is that this might have something to do with people remembering things based on what you pay attention to. Because as we know, you're more likely to remember something that you pay more attention to, right? And if a language necessarily makes you pay more attention to certain things, then they're going to be sort of more in your memory. They're going to be more available to you when you're sort of using that language, right? And the kind of result that this ends up having, what we kind of see is that, we can do tests on people where, we basically have two buttons saying past or future, right? And we show people images, and they need to determine whether that image is of the past or the future, like sort of sci-fi stuff, let's say, right? So very obvious, right? If you have, let's say, just for example's sake, a black and white photo of a Victorian-looking person, that you'd say past, right? If you have a space, age, technology, laser gun with an alien or something, you'd put that as future.
Unless you're a conspiracy theorist.
Or unless you're a Star Wars fan. So
yes, a long time ago. Yeah. That's always been very incongruent, the start of Star Wars movies. What? You what?
It's like, what? Okay, sure. It's the galaxy far, far away. Far away.
Double far.
Exactly.
Big away.
But the point, no, really though. Yeah. But the point being that, if you give someone that test of sort of showing them images and they have to press a button determining whether that image is a past image or a future image sort of thing, very, very easy. That's not the actual test. What you do is you either you could put the past one on the left or right of the future one, right? So if the past is on the left and you're speaking a language wherein, the past is generally to the left, so say where you read left to right, so say English or French or German or any of those languages, you will see people perform sort of better or do it more quickly when it's in the correct, in quotes, correct order, as in past on the left and future on the right. They take longer to do it if future is on the left and the past is on the right. You know what I mean? So if you swap the sort of natural direction for that language speaker, they'll take longer to perform that task. And if you have a sort of, say, the past on the top and the future on the bottom, has no effect whatsoever. But with a Mandarin speaker, if you have if you have them in the wrong way, sort of top to bottom, that has an effect. And that's obviously that would be for monolinguals, right? And I should just say as well, you can sort of change how quickly you can process this information. By just making someone, like training someone to read things from sort of right to left. So if you sort of, if you basically just give someone like sort of mirrored text and teach them to read that, they'll perform better on that sort of test, even when the sort of buttons are the wrong way around. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, totally. Like the idea of doing that, just thinking about that, having the buttons on the wrong side, that's freaking me out.
Like, you would notice it, and like you might not even notice why you're noticing it. It would just feel wrong.
Yeah, it's like when you do one of those tests to check if you have like a cognitive bias against like people of a certain group, and they like put the buttons in certain places.
I don't feel the need to take those tests often, Luke, because I
don't see color.
No, that would be a colorblind test. No, I don't take the bias tests because I've never displayed any bias to anyone ever. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, basically in the bias tests, they place the button in such a way that's going to detect your bias.
Right.
Does that make sense?
I guess
because it's all about the micro. How much longer it takes you to get the correct answer. Either if you're super biased, you'll just get the wrong answer. But then if you have a slight automatic bias, you'll have to like stop yourself
like the
and then press it. So it's about the automatic response you have.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. But it's really interesting. But what we've been talking about up until this point is just monolinguals. So when we bring this into sort of bilinguals, it gets really interesting. So I've got a quote here from Panos Athanasopoulos. Panos Athanasopoulos.
You really need to start reading your notes before we start this.
I read it so many times. It's a long Greek name, and like I don't know what it is. My brain, I just really like if I'm reading something long.
Yeah.
My brain sometimes is just like
when
it creates a shortcut.
Yeah.
I don't read the thing. It's just I know what that is. I don't need to read it, and it's not conscious.
Yeah.
It's just
when
automatic.
I do my SCI GUYS episodes, every complicated name I like write it out phonetically in my notes beforehand.
I've done that before, and it just makes it worse. Like I honestly, we just need to deal with me butchering names just a little bit at first.
Okay.
It's not a lack of respect. I just have ADHD and I'm very stupid. Anyway,
and are not Greek.
remains to be seen. I was going to do a Greek accent, but I don't even know what a Greek accent sounds like. Anyway, with bilinguals, you are literally looking at two different languages in the same mind. This means you can establish a causal role of language on cognition if you find the same individual changes in their behavior when the language context changes. So, if we look at sort of bilingual Mandarin and English speakers, they had a preference for left to right mental time over right to left, but they were also quicker to react to the pictures, the pictures and the buttons, if the future button was below the past button. So in Mandarin, you remember, future is down and past is up. So if you've got a button that says past on top, above the future button, then that's natural.
You're Gucci, yeah.
That's good. But also, because they're bilingual English and Mandarin, they show a preference for both. So if the button is on the left, if the past button's on the left and the future button's on the right, that helps. If the past button is above the future button, that also helps.
What if the buttons are diagonal?
Right. Well, I'm not super sure, Luke.
I feel like they'd be superhuman at that point.
So
they finished the test before they started the test.
Well, yeah, but what to take from this is that they see it in sort of they've got two, not necessarily contradictory, but they've got two different views of the direction of time.
Yeah.
So sort of top to bottom makes sense, but also left to right makes sense for them. But what's more interesting than this is that that you can kind of like sort of mix and match different languages with different conceptions of time and kind of put them together to see what happens, right? So Swedish time is in front of you. So future is front time. It's literally the word translated into English. The Swedish word framtid is front time, right? In another language, Aymara, I think it is, which is from, I think, Bolivia, Chile, Peru, and Argentina, future means behind time. So they see, as I was saying earlier, they see future as being behind them. So they'll make backward gestures to the future, whereas, you'd make forward gestures to the future otherwise. And when you sort of when you start to try to look at all of this, they've started trying to do more studies on, well, what happens when things sort of contradict, or what happens when, how does this sort of switch work? And when we sort of look at this, what we find is that, you basically kind of switch between different languages. So it's also affected by how well you know or understand the language, the sort of effect that it has. So, if you're not as good at Mandarin, the top to bottom thing will not have as much of an effect on you as if you're quite good at Mandarin, right? So your understanding of the language changes how that impacts you, right? Essentially, what we're finding is that, people can hold two different conceptions of something in their head. And when you have sort of two contradictory things, it depends on the language that is being spoken. So they took German speakers and English speakers, and bilingual German and English speakers. There's slightly different future tenses between English and German. So in German, you can say it rains tomorrow. Not in German, obviously, but you translate those words into German. You can literally say the words for the German words for it rains tomorrow. You don't need to use the future tense in that grammar, whereas in English we'd need to say sort of it will rain tomorrow, right? You can't just say it rains tomorrow. If you say it rains tomorrow, that sounds like it's a continuous action, like it always rains
tomorrow.
Exactly. So it's just slight differences in grammar, right? So in 2013, what they did was they took people that spoke sort of futureless languages, let's call them, and they wanted to see whether they had a different relationship to the future compared to sort of, people that have more sort of common future tenses that they use in those languages. So those would be sort of English, French, Italian, Spanish, and Greek. Those would be the sort of future or futured languages, as they called them. And the futureless languages like German, Chinese, Japanese, Dutch, those languages, again, it's not that they don't have a future tense, it's that the future tense is pretty similar to the present tense.
It doesn't modify the word in the same way that ours does.
Look, here's the thing. Grammar is difficult and complicated. We can use the present tense to mean something that's happening in the future. In certain cases, I think we can use the simple present to mean the future. We're going to the cinema tomorrow. We are going.
Yes, present tense.
is present.
Yeah, and then you modify it with tomorrow.
Yeah, just say tomorrow, and then you understand from context. Yeah, but it's complicated. But let's just think of them as futureless languages and future languages. All you need to know is that a common construction of this language means that you don't need to use future grammar to refer to something in the future.
Yeah.
In this context, right?
Yeah.
Very complicated. But what we basically found is that the futureless languages were more likely to engage in future-focused activities, like putting money into savings, like being less likely to smoke, being more physically active. And now the thing is that what kind of problem might you find with this study in itself? Like, is there any confounding factor you can think of?
Well, obviously, the people who speak the language are more likely to live in a different country, and so you're looking at societal differences, not necessarily language differences.
Cultural differences is the main thing, And so what they did was they went and looked at this again and tried to control for the cultural differences, and these were differences of like sort of 31% were more likely to put money into savings in the first experiment, right? So all of these numbers I'm giving you are from the first experiment where they didn't control for culture. So it would be 31% more likely to put money into savings, 24% less likely to smoke, 29% more likely to be physically active, and 13% less likely to be medically obese. All of these sorts of things were they controlled for socioeconomic status and religion, but when they went back to do it again and sort of controlled for the cultural sort of aspects, there was a much weaker correlation, but still, according to the researcher, the hypothesis still seems surprisingly robust. But there was still something there. It seemed not insignificant, but the differences fell dramatically. So it seems that language may have an effect on how we, outside of just culture, it may have an effect on actual behavior, not just how you perform in weird experimental tasks or how you kind of explain stuff, but actually how you relate to things, which makes sense, you know?
Well, either that language does have that effect, or that places where it is normal to do those things developed that in their language, or would that be controlled for in the cultural bit?
I don't think you really can control for that, and I feel like what you're saying isn't. I don't know how much that would hold up, because what you're kind of saying there, I guess, is that people are just naturally more likely to do this thing, and so that is like their language evolved based on that. So you'd then be saying there are this group of people that are naturally more likely to avoid.
Not necessarily naturally genetically, but like if they are, like for example, if you're in an area in the world where you, like for example, if you're in an area of the world where it has harsh winters, you're more likely to think and empathize with your winter self, because your winter self is really going to need your summer self to stack some food away, right? Whereas if you're in an area that doesn't have as harsh winters, you're not needing to do that quite so much.
But then how would this work for people that speak that language without living in the same country? Or people that are bilingual?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no. So I think it seems like, from what we can see, it seems that language does have an effect on the way that you think,
right,
when using that language. That's the interesting thing there, because we can see differences when people switch between languages. Like, they literally think differently depending on the language that they're sort of using.